Before you even dive into Ulysses, there are 5 books that I really recommend that you read, and I'll explain why in this video, why you should read them. And they're great books on their own, either way, so check them out. These are the ones that I would say are essential. You know, there's a lot of books in Ulysses that are referenced in different ways, but these ones, if you're missing these ones, you're just going to be missing a lot of the book. So check these out. The first one, the Odyssey. If you didn't know, Ulysses is based on the Odyssey in certain ways. Even though it's set in Dublin in 1904, and the Odyssey is set in ancient Greece, there are similarities and there's going to be a lot of overlap. They're not identical by any means. They're very different. And if you don't know the Odyssey, there's a lot of movie versions too. If you do the lazy man approach, there's a version with Kirk Douglas. There's a more recent version in the 90s. There's cartoons and so on. So you can get the story. It's basically an adventure story about this guy after a war heading home to his family, and it takes him 10 years. Has all these adventures along the way. Ulysses is going to mirror that, distort that, play on that. Joyce uses it as a framework, really, to get his story going, but by no means are they the same story. I'll talk a lot more about it later on. Joyce's first exposure to Ulysses, or actually to the Odyssey, was through a book called The Adventures of Ulysses by Charles Lamb. This is a kind of a simplified version for children. It's actually a pretty neat book. It has some great pictures. It's available on archive.org in PDF form for free. I'll link in the info for this video. But however you get the story of Odysseus or his Roman counterpart Ulysses, I think having that as a background will really help you as we explore James Joyce's book. Next book that you really should know is the Bible. And you're like, oh man, the Bible, that's a long book. How am I going to read all that? Well, you don't need to know the whole Bible. There's a lot of books that Joyce barely even touches on. And really, the story of Jesus is the main things that he touches on. Joyce was raised Catholic, so there's no getting away from his Catholicism, his upbringing, and Catholic Ireland at the time, 1904, was largely Catholic. He does reference some of the earlier parts, Genesis, things that people kind of know in a mythological way. But if you're going to pick one section of the Bible, focus on the New Testament, and if you really want to just get the basic gist of it, read the book of Matthew. That will give you the life story of Jesus. There's more details, obviously, in other books, but if you pick one book, if you just want to get going with Ulysses, then read that one. Another major focal point in the book is Shakespeare, and that's really because Joyce is enveloping and repackaging and riffing on everything that has happened before in literature, and Shakespeare is simply a major force in literature up to Joyce's time, certainly. One of the characters, Stephen Dedalus, actually gives a lecture on Shakespeare, specifically on the play Hamlet. So if you don't know Hamlet, that's really the one I would recommend. Obviously, there are other great plays by Shakespeare, King Lear, Romeo and Juliet, Julius Caesar, Macbeth, Othello, etc., etc. I can go on, but you don't need to know all of them in detail to get the story of Ulysses. But if you don't know Hamlet, you're really going to be missing a lot in that chapter where Stephen gives the lecture. Aside from those 3 books, the 2 books that I would say that are essential are the two previous books by James Joyce, Dubliners and A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Dubliners is a collection of short stories. I would actually say that's the best place to start with James Joyce. They are much more grounded in straightforward storytelling. They're not going to be as innovative, as impressionistic, as experimental as his later works by any means. So if you can tackle each of those stories one at a time, you'll be much better prepared for Ulysses. And in addition to that, a lot of the characters in Dubliners show up again in Ulysses. So it's really a good backdrop. Joyce was building his cast in Dubliners, and it's a good place to start. Aside from that, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. I'm not as fond of this book, although I'm rereading it right now, and I enjoy it. Those 2 books in general, though, if I had just read those, I wouldn't be as enthusiastic for James Joyce. They lack the humor, although there are moments of humor, certainly, but they lack the exuberant, wild experimentation that you're going to see later on in Ulysses. But they're good starting points, and they prepare you for Joyce's style and with each of his books, he's going to be expanding his possibilities. So start with Dubliners, move on to Portrait, and then, you'll be ready for Ulysses. He also wrote a play called Exiles. I'm not very fond of it. He also did some poetry, and again, I'm not super excited about it. Really, just Dubliners and Portrait will get you where you need to go, and they're just a launch pad for Ulysses. With these 5 books under your belt, you'll be so much better prepared for starting Ulysses.